Hello and welcome. This media recording accompanies the course Introduction to American Government, Political Science 1101, taught by Dr. Greg Dixon of the Department of Political Science and Planning at the University of West Georgia. This media recording is copyright 2013 by Gregory C. Dixon, and all rights are reserved. Students in Dr. Dixon's courses, as well as the faculty and staff of the University of West Georgia, are given permission to use these media files for nonprofit educational use. This includes the right to copy, transfer, or share these files with other students, members of the faculty, or the staff of the university. This is the first of a series of lectures in this course on American government, and I always like to start off with a real basic statement for anybody who's listening to these outside of the course, and that is that these are designed to be part of the course. They are not designed to be a complete course on American politics. I leave a great deal of the sort of nuts and bolts work to the course textbooks. So anyone who's listening to this as an American government course where they're just kind of curious or you found it online somewhere, be sure to go look up a copy of the syllabus, see which textbooks are relevant for the course, and get a copy of those textbooks and to read those as well. These lectures are designed to supplement the material and to kind of bring everything together thematically, and also to explore some ideas that textbooks, for a variety of reasons, just simply don't really ever tackle. And this first lecture is actually one of those topics. It's one that a lot of times textbooks will give a couple paragraphs to at least the first of the two questions, which is, what is politics? The second question that I like to tackle in the first lecture is, and why do we hate it? There's a reluctance in courses on American politics to admit that a lot of people really kind of hate politics. They hate the idea that there's these people just yelling at each other. And a lot of times in American politics, it really does look like it's mostly angry people screaming at each other on television. And that's not what politics is at all. And if you believe that there's something wrong today because we hate politics, well, I would actually say that if you look at the sweep of history, it would be far stranger if you liked politics than if you hate politics. So it would be a weird world if everybody thought that politics was just awesome, for reasons that I intend to at least try to explain in this lecture. So this lecture is about what politics is and why pretty much everybody who's ever invented it or encountered it has always come to hate it very quickly. The most basic question, of course, to start off with is, what is politics? What do we mean when we say politics? I could go into a whole long discussion of sort of the Greek origins of the word, but it's not something that people care about that much. And in the couple paragraphs that are in the book, that is actually one of the things that's discussed. When I talk about politics, what I mean is the process by which we decide who gets what, where, when, and how. And this is actually an important part of understanding what we're going to be studying in this course. We're going to be studying the process by which we as a country and as a political unit discuss these big picture issues. Who gets what, where, when, and how. This is simultaneously a big picture and small picture question. Who within society gets what? Do we transfer wealth from the young workers to the old retirees? But also it's an individual question. Where do you fit into this? How is the government going to determine what you get, when, where, and how you get it? Are you a person who's going to get federal financial aid for college, or are you not? These are the kinds of questions that political science tackles. Political science ultimately is the study of how large groups of people make decisions about issues that matter. Group decisions are key, and they are how we think about questions of politics. Politics is a tool that humans developed to help us make collective decisions. Even in a family unit, you can have something that looks a little like politics, although its rules are very different because it's a small integrated social unit. And in those kinds of small groups, it can be simple. It can be complex, it can be difficult for you as an individual, but for the most part, small group politics is straightforward when it comes to decision making. The parents make the decisions, and then as long as the kids are part of the household, they have to abide by those decisions. But the bigger you make the group, the harder it is to make collective decisions. So if we're talking about 2 people, that's one thing. But if we're talking about 315 million of them, it is a whole different picture. Now, the slide that just popped up here looks at group size. It starts out with a relatively small city, Carrollton, Georgia, the home of the University of West Georgia, of about 20,000 people, and ranges up through the country as a whole. But one of the things to think about is before we even get to this level, before we get to these group sizes, think about how, even at relatively low numbers, increasing the number of people makes decisions more complicated. Think about it this way. You are hungry and you want to go someplace to buy something to eat. If it's just you, that's a pretty easy decision. I'm hungry. I need a hamburger. Which of the various proprietors that sell hamburgers around town am I going to go eat? Now, there's still a choice. Do I just do a quick sort of fast food meal and run over to Steak and Shake and get a burger there? Or, do I really want a good high quality hamburger? And I'm going to go to the Alley Cat where it's grass-fed beef from a local farm, that kind of thing. You still have a choice, even in a small town like Carrollton, of multiple burger places. But you as an individual can make that choice fairly easily. Now, it's you and a couple people that you're living with in the residence halls. There's 4 of you. Well, now it gets more complicated because maybe everyone doesn't want a burger. Somebody wants chicken. Somebody else wants fish. Somebody else is vegan and doesn't want any of the above. It gets harder and harder the bigger the group. And it's hard for you to know everyone in the group and their quirks and their habits as you make a group bigger and bigger and bigger. Human beings are hardwired really to know a limited number of people as distinct individuals with rememberable characteristics. This isn't me. This is sort of evolutionary biology, cognitive science. They've figured out that human beings really have a limit. And it's different a little bit from person to person, but really we're somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people as a hardwired limit. We are just not able to recognize individuals and keep track of all their characteristics beyond that number. And so we shorthand it. Sometimes this is negative. It can be prejudice. Everybody who's like this is somehow bad. But in other cases, it's practical. When a student meets a college professor that they've never met before, there's a set of expectations about the role of college professor. When a student meets another student in a class, there's a set of ideas about what those roles are going to be. And we layer those rules together to figure out how to act when we meet new people. Nice and simple. But in politics, there's a problem. If it's you and your friends from the residence halls, you know who likes chicken, you know who's vegan, you know all these things, and so you can sort of figure out, well, we're going to have to go to one of these places to eat. We're going to go to the Alley Cat because they have food that vegans can eat. Or we're going to go to the farmer's cupboard and do their lunch because they always have food that vegans can eat. We're not going to go to McDonald's where you never know what was in the fries or the fry oil. These are the kind of things where if you know the people, you can really easily make the decision. It becomes challenging because more and more elements get involved. But when you still know everybody, you know the parameters. Not just what their food limits are, but you also know who always goes out to eat and is $1 short. Who always needs to borrow $1 when it's time to pay for the pizza? Who are the 2 or 3 people who always will fork over the extra $1? The sinners, the saints, the people who are always short, the people who are always generous, the people who are always generous but only to certain kinds of people, the guy who's always willing to buy the girl a drink, the girl who's always willing to have the guy buy her a drink, all these kinds of personality quirks in your circle of friends because you know these people. But when you're dealing with strangers or people outside your circle of friends, people you don't know, it becomes much more difficult. Okay, here's where group size gets really complicated. When we think about politics, we have in the United States a federal system. There are different levels of politics: state politics, local politics, and also federal politics. Even at the most basic of these levels, the city, a city like Carrollton, Georgia, which is relatively small, as cities go, with 20,000 people in it, you can't possibly know everyone in town. You might kind of know everybody and you joke about knowing everybody, but you don't really know everybody. Even if you grew up here, you spent your whole life here, you don't really know everyone in town. You might have people who's like, oh, I vaguely remember that person from high school, but you don't know anything about them. But you don't know them. You don't know them well enough that you can trust them in decision making, to always act in a particular predictable way. Now, if we go over to Atlanta, which has actually grown since this slide was first produced, Atlanta keeps growing every year. But a couple of years ago when I put this together, Atlanta had about 500,000 people. That's now up closer to 700,000 people. And the greater Atlanta metro area has well over 1 million. But it's much bigger than Carrollton. And so in Atlanta, there will be literally hundreds of thousands of people that not only do you not know, you will never meet them. You'll never encounter them. And that's in a relatively small major city. And I know that's a bit of an odd distinction. Relatively small major city. But when you look at the Los Angeles number there, 3.8 million people just in the city, that's much bigger than Atlanta. And here, again, not only are you going to have lots of people that you don't know, you're going to have, in the Los Angeles case, millions of people that you've never met. And of course, you get up to the USA, and again, this is a number that the census folks have revised upward slightly. We're now about 315 million people, but you get the point. When you get to the federal level, there are going to be hundreds of millions of people making decisions with you in a group, but that you will never encounter, you will never meet, ever. So when we get to these really large groups, you can't depend on things like knowing the person in order to make decisions. Well, why does this matter? Well, one of the biggest reasons that this matters is because of scarcity. There's not enough to go around. We have a limited supply of resources. And because we have a limited supply of resources, you can't always get everything that you want. You cannot have everything that you want in life. If everybody in the United States who wanted a beach house in San Diego could have a beach house in San Diego, there'd be a couple 100 million people living on the beach in San Diego, but there's not enough beach. You can't fit them all on the beach in San Diego. And that's a problem. And because lots of people want to live there, little tiny houses are insanely expensive. And these are the kinds of things that can be problematic for politics. Who gets what, where, when, and how, because we're going to disagree over this. Because I can't get everything that I want. And no one else can either, because there isn't enough for that. Think about if you could get absolutely everything that you wanted materially in life. And then think about if everybody you knew also made that wish list. Now think about all of you trying to get all of that in the real world, not in the magical world where wishes come true, but in the real world that we live in which all of that has to get produced. All of that has to actually get developed and distributed. And there's only so much physical space to go around. So scarcity is one of the biggest reasons why collective decision is going to be trouble for all of us. Because we can't know everybody, and a lot of the people, we're talking hundreds of millions of people, we're never even going to encounter them. So we don't even know them as a physical person, we know them abstractly. I know that there is this person out there, but I've never seen them. So how do we divide up the resources with all these other people? Well, we're always going to argue because we're never going to agree. I always want more than I've got. And no matter how much you give someone, they always want more. There's no end to the satisfaction of these kinds of things. Now, you go to the point where it's like, well, I'm thinking I'm going to buy $1 million car instead of, I'm going to buy the Nissan Versa. But the types of things people are going after are more expensive, sure. At the same time, what we're talking about here is a general set of desires that people have. The desire to have something. The desire to have something that's distinctive, to have something else. For the vast majority of the country, it's simply a matter of, I want to live a better life than my parents did. Well, everybody in the country wants to live a better life than their parents did. Everybody wants to be as wealthy as they can make themselves. Even if you have modest desires, there's only so much to go around. The economy only grows so fast. Only so much new wealth is produced. Political institutions are how we solve these big picture problems. They're how we make collective decisions. Political institutions don't solve the problem of scarcity. There is still going to be scarcity. There's not enough to go around. There is always going to be competition because none of us can get everything we want. But they do solve a very important problem, which is the process by which we will make decisions. We'll still be upset at the end because we won't get everything that we want, but we will agree that there is a legitimate process. And the simplest way to sort of put this out there, and it gets weaker the farther we get from this particular case, but it's still something that at least hopefully everyone has heard of. In the 2000 election, President, or soon-to-be President, George W. Bush was running against the sitting Vice President, Al Gore, and the election came down to the state of Florida. Now, the state of Florida had a problem. This was a really close election with millions and millions of people voting. And their voting system involved punching holes in cards, and the holes didn't always get punched quite right. And so when you only have a couple of hundred people who can swing an election one way or the other, it actually ended up being a couple of thousand people, but at the time it looked like it was going to literally be, out of a state of tens of millions, a couple of hundred ballots that might have swung the election one way or the other. How you count those ballots and how you treat ballots where the person may have screwed up, they may have made a mistake and punched 2 holes instead of 1, and what do you do in those circumstances? Those things suddenly become important. Now, the state of Florida was controlled by the Republican Party, controlled, in fact, by the brother as governor of the presidential candidate George W. Bush. His brother Jeb was governor of Florida. And the political establishment in Florida set a rule that essentially made it so that by that system of counting, George W. Bush won the state of Florida and got to be president. Al Gore's campaign was concerned that this possibly would have misrepresented the votes, that if the votes were counted differently, then Al Gore would have won the state of Florida and with it the presidential election. I won't bore you with all the gory details, but what I will say is the case goes to the Supreme Court eventually. They actually fast-tracked it. It got there relatively quickly. And the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Florida had a system of rules for the election, and that by those rules, Florida had certified that George W. Bush had won the state, and that therefore George W. Bush had won the state. There was no evidence of criminal activity, of fraud, or anything like that. This was literally just down to real technicalities, which it was. And as a result, it was within Florida's rights under the Constitution to make whatever decision they thought fit the legal framework. So, the Supreme Court of the United States essentially ruled that George W. Bush would be president. And George W. Bush becomes president. In countries that do not have strong political institutions, people who lose in very controversial ways like this oftentimes try to go outside the institutions. We have contemporary examples from all over the world. As I'm recording this, we have examples in lots of different countries where the loser of an election says, I didn't really lose this election. It was fraud. It was corruption. And so I'm calling my supporters, hey, let's go out in the streets. We're going to protest. We're going to engage in activity against the person who the government claims won. And we're going to rally to try to change the result of the election, sometimes through peaceful protest, but other times through violence. And they actually literally say, hey, my friends in the army, come support me and let's do a coup. We don't like the way this election went, so we're going to overthrow the people who the government says were elected. Now, in the United States, we have strong political institutions. Al Gore, when the Supreme Court ruled, said, I lost. Congratulations, George W. Bush. It probably never occurred to Al Gore to call his supporters into the streets to try to create so much instability that the decision would be changed and he would become president. It probably never even entered into his mind that he might try to call the people he knew in the military and get military units to stage a coup to make him president. These probably were literally never even entered his mind as whims, because we have very strong institutions, we have a very strong political culture, and doing that is just alien. Now, people did go out in the streets and protest. They said, George W. Bush is not my president, and whatever. But basically, small numbers. And nobody was going out saying, and we want to overthrow him. They were going out saying, because he got into office this way, he doesn't have as much legitimacy, so when he tries to put policies through Congress, this will make it easier to block them. So, in the United States, our political institutions tell us that we agree that we're going to follow legitimate decisions. We accept legitimate decisions, even if we don't agree with them. And we do this because the institutions are more important to us than any single decision. If we go back in history, we have a number of elections that essentially are comparable. In fact, the 2000 election is pretty typical of some, but pretty mild by the standards of others. The 1960 election, there was enormous evidence that fraud had been committed in some cities, relatively mild by electoral fraud standards, but you had large numbers of people, several thousand of them in some districts, voting in alphabetical order in Texas, and dead people voting in Chicago and things like that. And Richard Nixon was approached by his political advisors when he was appearing to lose that election, and they said, we've got some evidence that there's some fraud, that there was actually dirty tricks going on. And, we could probably challenge this. And Richard Nixon, while he has a pretty rough reputation as an American president now, in 1960 actually made a real serious decision that the best interest of the country during the Cold War, where it was bad for it to look weak, was that no dispute arose over the election. And so even though, and people still argue to this day, historians about this election and political scientists argue whether there really was enough fraud that it made a difference in the election, or whether in some cases there was really even any serious fraud at all, because this is before the internet and everything else, so we don't have a big record of all of this stuff. But it's pretty clear there was at least some fraud. There was enough that they were willing to try to go to court to work on it. But Nixon said no. He said that that's just not going to work. And in large part, it was the Cold War, and he didn't want to look weak to the Soviets. But in part two, he was calculating that the people wouldn't really like arguing about the outcome of the election because we have a system, and we agree to follow the legitimate dictates of the system. So the Republican Party, even though they hate the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and all of its provisions, they don't say we're going to call the army out and depose President Obama instill somebody else, and then reverse Obamacare. They do it through the ballot box. They go to Americans and say, hey, elect us and we'll repeal this. Or, vote more Republicans into the Senate so we can control the Senate and we can try to do that. So it's all politics. And they use legislative tools and all that kind of stuff to try to do it. But nobody calls out the Army because we all agree that we have these institutions. So institutions seem like a pretty cool thing here, but they didn't just sort of magically appear. They had to be created. So why do people go to the trouble and expense of creating the sorts of institutions which we take for granted in the United States? Well, partly because without institutions, we are in what we usually call the state of nature, the true state of nature that the philosophers that kind of first use it, the way that they conceived of it, there is no such thing. There's never really a state of nature where all humans are just wandering around as individuals, because we don't just magically appear. We come into families and things, so there's always a social unit. But from a political standpoint, if you do not have institutions, there's no government. We are all just out there. And in those conditions, we nearly always see what Thomas Hobbes, the English moral philosopher / political philosopher, called the state of nature. What he described this as was, in Latin, bellum omnium contra omnes, in English, the war of all against all. The state of nature, to Thomas Hobbes, is a state of war. Without institutions to make us behave ourselves, we run around conking each other over the head and taking each other's stuff. Without institutions, force, physical violence, establishes the rules. If you want an example of this at the country level, you can go to Somalia. There is a government that the international community recognizes as governing Somalia, and they control a small part of the country, but the vast majority of the rest of the country is essentially either controlled by other people who aren't recognized or essentially lawless. And it's not a good place to be born. It's a rough place. There is no clear government authority, and this means that there is no rule of law. There's no recourse. If a warlord wants to come beat you over the head and take something, or if you're a woman, if they want to rape you, then you basically have nothing but force. If you're strong enough to fight them off, then you can do that, but far more often, average citizens just sort of have to take the abuse. It doesn't have to be a complete collapse of institutions. If we look here in the United States, we see that when institutions fail, even temporarily, bad things can happen. Post-Hurricane Katrina New Orleans, while we now know from a lot of studies that were done subsequently that the horror stories you saw on many television programs were mostly just that, stories, we did see looting. We did see pretty horrific breakdowns of human behavior. In some cases, actually police who were scared and frightened, shooting groups of unarmed people because they were simply frightened by them. And it's a breakdown in order. The normal rules don't apply. Police didn't protect citizens. They preyed upon citizens. Average citizens didn't obey the law. They broke the windows of the store and they stole stuff, things like that. And so in that case, it's just temporary. The institutions broke down, and it took a couple of days for everything to get restored to normal. But in extreme cases, like Somalia, the whole system can collapse. But without institutions, force, ultimately violence, prevails. There are lots of institutions. If this was a class in a different discipline, we'd talk about family and cultural institutions. But there are lots and lots of institutions. Some have formal written rules. If you form a student organization on campus, you have to have bylaws. Those are your formal written rules. But you also have all manner of other institutions, some of which have informal rules, some of which have what don't look like any rules at all, but do have sort of rules of thumb that people operate on. We're not going to really worry about the full range of institutions. In this class, we're going to focus on government institutions. The vast majority of what we'll be discussing are the institutions of the U.S. national government. We will, to some extent, be discussing Georgia state government, largely to sort of show how these things apply at the state level and to look at some of the areas where the sort of state application of these ideas is a little different than the federal government ideas, which actually does happen quite frequently. Georgia's constitution is a much newer constitution than the constitution of the federal government. In fact, Georgia has had a bunch of constitutions as we tried to sort of work out for the state of Georgia what the best set of institutions was. Okay, Dr. Dixon, you have explained what politics is, why political institutions matter, why we should sort of care about these things in a general sense. But why do we hate politics? Well, it's actually really simple. We never get what we want. Politics is a system for decision making that is doomed by scarcity. There's no way to give everybody everything that they want. It's impossible to provide enough things to enough people to give everyone what they want. So, because you can never get what you want, you're always going to be frustrated. The institutions and the structure of decision making are going to force compromise. In the political process, it's not a case where you have one group arguing with another. You have thousands of groups all arguing at the same time, all pushing for their ideas and their agendas. It's impossible for all of those groups to get everything they want. And in some cases, it's impossible for some of those groups to get any of what they want at all. And under those conditions, compromise is the only way to make decisions. And the institutions force that compromise. You've got to get a majority in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, and you have to have the president sign it into law. A couple years later, after everybody sues like crazy, the Supreme Court has to uphold the law as constitutional. You want to get through that system, run all those gauntlets, you're going to have to compromise. You're going to have to compromise with other groups, and you're going to have to compromise with the rules, with the law. I would really like to do this. Well, that's unconstitutional. Shucks. I've got to find a way that I can do it within the Constitution. The funny thing, though, is we all know intellectually that it's impossible for us to get everything we want. But we're still mad about it. We're still upset. We still don't like it. We know we can't get everything we want, but it sucks. We rebel against the idea. We know we can't possibly get it, but we're still left unsatisfied by the process. In fact, in some such situations where you're with a group that tends to lose more arguments than it wins, it can be very frustrating. Politics can be very frustrating. The real ultimate thing that gets people upset with politics is that politics is the art of the possible, not the art of the ideal. If politics were the art of the ideal, it would presuppose that there was one ideal. And there is no one ideal. None. Everybody disagrees to some degree or the other. 315 million people in the United States, and there are 315 million different opinions, and probably even more than that because a lot of people hold multiple opinions simultaneously on a given issue. And so when you have to make an actual policy decision, it's about what you can do, not about what ideally you should do. It's about what you can do. If you look at the Affordable Care Act, 85% of Americans, according to surveys at the time, argued that the government should do something about health care. And after that, everybody disagreed like crazy. But everybody in the country, not everybody, but a vast majority, agreed something had to be done. Well, politics is the art of the possible. Hey, it's clear that the overwhelming majority of the country wants something done, but they have no idea what they actually want done. So what are we going to do about this? Well, we're going to look to see what we can possibly do. And the Affordable Care Act became this sort of wish list. Here are all of the things that all the different groups would want so that they will support this bill. That's how this bill becomes 2,000 pages long, with millions of pages of administrative law that will be made by government agencies later. We'll talk about where that comes from later in the course when we talk about the bureaucracy. But the bill itself, the basic law, is 2,000 pages long, almost. Why? Because you have to put a bunch of provisions in there that get all of the various players to play. Because if they don't, you're going to get nothing. And when 85% of the country says they want something, politicians are going to try very hard to give it to them. Now, our institutions are designed to make this difficult. The American political institutions are designed to reduce the range of possible choices by making it hard for the government to act. And the problem with those circumstances, any political system is always going to make it so what you get out of the system is going to leave people unsatisfied. But a system like ours that's deliberately designed to make things hard leaves a lot of people upset. When people actually read what was in the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare legislation, a lot of people said, oh, hey, well, wait a minute. That's not what I wanted. And a majority of Americans, very quickly after Obamacare passed, were opposed to the bill. So somewhere you get this 85% the government must do something opinion number, which is simultaneously held by people in which a majority of the country, about 60, 61% at the time, opposed what the government had done. Because it was such a big bill with so many things in it, people kept finding individual things they didn't like. So people are always upset. We're never happy with the outcome. And the Affordable Care Act is really controversial. Some people like it, some people hate it, which is why it's really cool for this kind of an example. Because we're never happy with the outcome. The people who wanted a single-payer, government-funded healthcare system like they have in Canada or the United Kingdom, they were really mad because they didn't get it. It wasn't even on the table. It was thrown out early on. Well, that's because a substantial majority of the country does not want that. That bill that had that in there would not have passed. There are lots of other people who say they don't want the government to be in healthcare at all, except that that group is also a minority. A healthy majority of the country wants government to provide health care to the poor and to the elderly. And so we're always left unhappy because we get pieces of what we want while having pieces of what we want thrown out. And this is one of the fun things about these big bills. Everybody always gets mad when they're over. And they're mad for a really simple reason. There is no perfect policy. None. Zero. None. Because human beings don't all agree with each other. People disagree, sometimes violently, vehemently, over issues. But we still have to make decisions as a group. And politics is how we do that, even though we can't all agree. It's how we end up with the good enough policy. And not the ideal policy. In the United States, we have a system as well in which the Constitution, the basic institutions that were set up, are also supposed to protect individual Americans from exploitation by others. This is problematic because while they are intended to do that, it's not how they've functioned, at least not perfectly, for a good chunk of the history of the country. Native Americans and African Americans in particular were on the short end of this. African Americans through slavery, segregation, and really the denial of basic rights. And Native Americans who basically had all of those above, plus what was essentially an attempt to destroy completely their cultural heritage in the 1800s to the early 1900s. So there are groups that were left out. But when applied in the way they were intended to be applied to the entire population, there is protection in the system of government of the United States against what we call oftentimes the tyranny of the majority, which we'll be talking about later in the class. That basic question of what is politics, who gets what, where, when, and why, these are determined by our political institutions. And so throughout the course, we're going to be talking about this kind of a framework. How do our institutions determine these things? Who benefits from this institutional arrangement? Who benefits from having a system that's set up like we do? So we're going to talk throughout the course about the role that institutions play and the incredibly large transformations that the country has experienced in institutions. We're going to talk about this in a number of contexts, but we're going to also talk about it with these sort of linchpin points, like the Civil War, the build-up to it, and then the war itself, the modernization of the country in the industrial era and the Gilded Age moving into the dawn of big government when we're looking at the two world wars and the interwar period, and then how things like entitlements come about, where the regulatory state comes from, all these things that are added into the institutions. But before we look at all of the details, before we try to understand the big picture of American politics, we need to go look at these institutions that are the foundation of American government and understand where they came from, why they were put together the way they were, as a foundation for understanding then how we change them over time. So we're going to take some steps in this course. We're going to move in this course to look at American institutions and to try to really understand American institutions. How were they designed? They didn't just magically appear. How are they designed? Most likely, in K through 12 education, you have a little bit of an idea about this, but there's a tendency in K through 12 to kind of put the Founding Fathers up on some pedestal. And the Founding Fathers are the ones who designed these institutions, but they weren't standing on a pedestal. They were people. They were just like you and just like me. It's just that they were in a particular moment in time where they were faced with a particular challenge, and they rose to it in a way that's almost unparalleled in human history. But it wasn't determined that they would, A, stand up and do it, or B, that they would succeed when they did. So who these people were, what the circumstances were at the time is important. What are the institutions supposed to do? Most people today forget what our institutions are really designed to do. We have this idea that the United States is a democracy, and that is a lie. That's not true. We are not a democracy. We are not supposed to be a democracy. The Founding Fathers would be pissed off that we call ourselves a democracy and that we worship this idea of democracy. They would really hate that because they took a lot of trouble and effort to make the country non-democratic in the way that they understood democracy. And in fact, the way we understand democracy as well, our institutions are just not designed that way. So what are they supposed to do? What is this framework? How is the institutional framework set up? Why would you set up a system that is explicitly a republic with representative institutions rather than a democracy? Why would you do that? And then how have we changed these institutions over time? Sometimes not really changing the institution itself, but how we see it and the kinds of things that we accept it doing to us and for us. And sort of how does this fit? How have our ideas changed? If you read the Federalist Papers and you see what was really on the minds of people, the real debates about what was important about the Constitution, some of them make perfect sense. I should be free from random imprisonment by the government. Okay, that we can pretty much identify with today. But there are a whole range of issues. There are multiple Federalist Papers dealing with the importance of making sure the government can't force you to have a squad of soldiers living in your house. Okay, well, we don't really worry about that today. It was a big worry then. We don't worry about it today. These kinds of things. And we're going to tackle these as the course goes along. One of the big things with this class is we're going to look at the transformation of institutions, and we're going to try to understand what the Founding Fathers were trying to do, how those ideas were modified in the early years in particular by practice. This is a neat idea, but what do we do when we actually face the real world with it? And in some cases, because essentially we run into circumstances where people's ideas are incompatible and there is no mechanism within the institutions for solving the disagreements. And so something has to either be invented or added, or in the case of the Civil War, we got to shoot people. And so there is a real interesting transformation in this class as we look from what the institutions originally stood for to what they actually do today, and then how we travel that journey. And so the institutions are where we're going to pick up the sort of origins of the Constitution, the origins of these ideas in the second lecture in this series. So I will always end these lectures pretty much the same way, so I'll put it out here on the table. If you have any questions about what was in this lecture or the ideas or how it connects to the textbooks, feel free to ask me in class. I'm always happy to open up during class discussions and expand upon these ideas. Or if you're not comfortable doing that, you can always email me. I'm happy to answer via email. And I'm also happy to talk to you in office hours. So just come by, see me in office hours, and we can talk about these ideas if you have any questions. And thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next lecture.